I'm a singer-songwriter and write and produce albums. That's kind of my deal right now. Also do a little bit of poetry and some writing.
Yeah, I'm also a singer-songwriter. Um, and that it's music that drives me. I like the performance of it, and it's been fun to turn, some of the work that I've done into a completed sound recording. Um, and country music, that's ultimately the style that I've invested in and chose early. So
I do jewelry and like my main job is actually communications, so I do a lot of writing as well and work with graphics and that kind of thing. Yeah.
And I do a lot with fabric and vegetables and fruit. I do a lot of canning. I enjoy cooking, and I do a lot of sewing. I do blankets and clothing and American Girl doll clothes and ribbon skirts and shirts, and I love fabric.
I think a lot of it started for me, at least, was with the fact that growing up, we went to just about every live performance that you could find. So we were always going over to Fargo to Trollwood, performing art school, or we'd go down to the cities. Anything that had live performance, we were taken to and exposed to. I remember a lot of trips while we're going to see relatives where we would sing in the car. And then one of my biggest things is whenever we'd experience something, we'd get home and my mom would say, "I bet we can make that." And she would always, um, you know, and oftentimes she did. That's the birthplace of a lot of creativity for our family.
I remember everybody that was there, but I remembered there was Fiddler on the Roof. That was a local production right there in Monoman, and that was there was adults that did it. It wasn't high school, which high school's great too, but it was fun because there was enough people that were. I mean, it's a small community, but enough people that were interested to do that, and it really was a really cool. I don't know. I mean, it's the first time I'd ever seen it, and it really pushed the limits on for me as to what could be on stage. And it's fun because you got scared, you're happy. There's singing, there was speaking parts, and I remember that was a big. Just sitting there and listening to that was really cool to me.
I grew up in Nadawash and lived there most of my life, I guess, except for we moved about 10 miles away, 15 miles away. But all of that growing up, our resources were limited, financially, but also, you couldn't go to the department store. There was none. And so when Doyle mentioned you would go home and try to recreate it, you did that because that was your only option. You didn't have a lot, and you didn't, there was no museums or anything like that close by. And when my husband traveled at one point, we went to Denver, Colorado, and we borrowed money to go, which was, maybe $300 or $400 at the time. But we took the kids, and his activities were, he was busy all day, and he had a hotel room, so we just all kind of got in there, so we didn't have to pay for that. But we went to museums and things like that, and it was things that I hadn't been able to do, but also my kids. It was a new thing for them. And so that I remember that, dragging them here, there, and wherever, and to see these things. And it was eye-opening for me as well. But I think that's where a lot of that we have to recreate it at home came from, is because we just didn't have those options.
I remember
Yeah.
that trip because we were there in a time when the snow fell, and it was out in Denver, so it was a different type of snow. And I think we rode the city bus to go see the zoo, or the Unsinkable Molly Brown had some
Yeah,
kind of a museum there or
yeah,
whatever. And then we went to a couple of big museums. but yeah, I remember that trip, and I didn't realize you guys had to borrow money to make sure
Yeah,
that we were able to
we had
go.
we had to go ask the banker for like $300 or $400. It was a big ask at the time. I mean, when I think about it now, it was a pittance, but we did it. So that worked out.
Did we go to the art museum there, Mom?
I believe so. I think it was the
'Cause I
first time I ever saw a mummy. And and there were earrings, either on the mummy or by the mummy or something. And it occurred to me that, that many years before, there had been someone who actually created something like that. And that was new to me. I had never thought of that.
I remember going to the Mint as well, like the Denver,
Yes.
where which was really cool. I think maybe we did a Benihana sort of experience there too.
Yeah, we could have done that too.
But I mean, and other pieces. I mean, Mandy, I'm happy to hand it off to you too, but it feels in this vein when Dad went to, or when we moved with Dad to Evanston, for him to do his become a Episcopalian reverend. It felt like Mom and Dad made a concerted effort to make sure we saw as much as we could see when we were down there, because we didn't have those opportunities um, at home, not because it's just such a small place, but we went to a lot of the museums there in Evanston, Chicago area. I remember going to Cats, which is I think the Broadway
Yeah.
talent, and then also I think what was it, the Jets and the what was the name? What's that
Oh, West
play?
Side Story.
West Side Story. Yeah,
Yeah.
Northwestern.
Yeah.
Northwestern students are putting that on, but I mean, just a plethora of, like, to me, ways that opened up what is possible, what type of cultural things are out there, which is a big deal for for it helps you to start to ask the question, what am I going to do? I really appreciated that.
And for me, how can we recreate it at home? And you doing that it was always in my mind a message between, that and what Dad did, was just that, you could do anything pretty much, just had to make up your mind and do it. And that's, always the message that got through to me watching you guys.
Well, I'm glad you got that, because I think I have read an article. I reread it not long ago. Anyway, it talks about creativity. They call it crafting. I call it creativity, and how that affects your brain. Those things are good for you. And so, I don't think we had that in mind when all this was going on, but I'm glad we did what we did.
There's a book by Jeff Tweedy on how to write just one song, and in that book he talks about his time in recovery. And one of the things that they did was they had an art class, and he watched people transform because of their interaction with creativity and making things.
Mhm.
And people who were non-communicative, becoming communicative. And he said in that book that the people who create um, their desire to destroy anything just nosedives, because creativity makes you appreciate life and makes you appreciate how things are put together, and so it makes any kind of feelings of just taking anything apart go away. And that I've carried that with me a lot. When we went to see a carving artist one time over in West Fargo, was Esther Horn's son-in-law, Bill Barney. And we were in his workshop, and he talked about how he loved to hunt ducks as a young person. And then as he grew older, they started to call the shots, so everybody wasn't shooting all at once. And then he said, pretty soon I was going out alone, and pretty soon I didn't even take a gun. I just took a gun or a camera. And he said, then I started carving. He says, because the more I did that, the more I realized, that was the beauty, that was in his carving. And we've still got one at Mom's place, and it looks like you can just put your finger right in the feathers of this mallard duck that he's carved. And I always remember that. And so we were around people who created. Mom always made things, always. I remember you doing loom work so that you could do the cross hangers, and you
Yeah.
made those for folks in the church, and then made them to sell, and that just always making things, knitting and crocheting, and there was always a creating of things. And my dad sang to us when we were young, would play guitar and sing us to sleep, and so there was always this making of things. And I think that's what has affected me the most.
I remember you talking about Grandma Marge too, and our grandparents owned the village store for a while in Nawash, and Mom telling me about how she would make. They didn't have it at the time, but Grandma would make pizzas and freeze them and sell frozen pizza. It was not anything that any corporation had put together even before that.
She just we would make them. She must have started about the time we moved, because you couldn't buy a frozen pizza. And so she would go to Dilworth, that had an Italian grocery store, and buy sticks of pepperoni and big chunks of mozzarella. And then she'd make her sauce, and she'd buy hot roll mix for the dough. And invariably, as it was rising, one of us would go in there and pinch it because it smelled so good. And then we'd get in trouble because you can't do that, because then it falls. But anyway, then she over the years bought pizza pans. I have one of them. I think they were like 59 cents. So she couldn't afford to buy a bunch, but we got up to where we could make about 20 of them, and piece of wax paper in between. We had to cut and shred the cheese, cut the pepperoni, and then make the pizzas. And then she'd put a piece of wax paper over them and stack them up and freeze them. And, that was pretty inventive at the time. So we could have frozen pizza. We could have been millionaires if she would have pursued that just a little bit further. But anyway, yeah.
And to dovetail off of, well, probably all of this, but Mandy was talking about the mom and dad doing what they did always. Like I remember having a really palpable sense that of what she mentioned, that you could do whatever you wanted to do. And it was odd to me because they never really sat down and said, you can do what you want to do. It wasn't just words. It was just the way they lived, which is odd to me. I think you've got, like, I don't know, it feels like communication is a large part of that, but I guess maybe it was communicating in a way that wasn't just verbal. It was showing us.
And your dad was a writer, and well, he was an Episcopal priest, so he wrote sermons, but he also wrote, there's a manuscript somewhere here that maybe someday, who knows, but he did a lot of those kinds of things. He wrote poems, and he wrote stories and about his youth. And I think his focus was to bring out the positive, because not everything is positive on the reservation, or hasn't been. So to bring out the positive and build people up.
When we made the move from Nadawash to Chicago, we were all so homesick, and because we'd never lived anywhere else. And it was such a foreign environment and a culture shock for us. And I ran across one of Dad's stories one time, and it was about a time when he and his dog had gone duck hunting, and his dog had scared away all the ducks. And it was such a trip back home to read that story. And so I think that's one of the first times I ever thought about that, oh, you can use writing to express how you're feeling or to fill a need, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so I was able to do some writing in high school and got some positive strokes for doing that. And so that kind of fueled and helped me find a direction with what I wanted to do. And so I became an English major and have a master's in English, and writing and words are my thing. And so I always think back to that stumbling across that handwritten story, and it was folded up and ripped out of a notebook. So I had all um, those fuzzy edges, and how that really served me as somebody who was wishing to be back home and in that environment. Um, and that's one of the things I always think of as a genesis to what I like to do with words.
I remember when we were in Chicago and we went down to the Indian Center, and I don't know if you guys went with us, but we were very homesick. And it was like, oh, there's so and so, but it wasn't, but we wanted it to be. It was good to be among people that we identified with.
Was that Navy Pier?
No,
Wasn't there a powwow there as well?
yeah,
Yeah, I remember going to that one.
yeah. Your dad and I went to see, was it Zero Mostel and Fiddler on the Roof?
Wow.
I slept through most of it because I needed to make enough money for my ticket. So one of the people was taking care of somebody who had broken both their arms or elbows or something. And they had two casts one on each arm. And so all you had to do was go over there and spend the night, and she would give me enough money for my ticket. Well, you'll sleep. No, you won't. Every 3 minutes a bell was ringing. By the time I left there, they couldn't have paid me enough money to go back. But I did get to go to Navy Pier to see Fiddler on the Roof. Yes.
Zero Mostel was the recording that we had.
Yeah.
On the phonograph.
Yeah.
You know what else I remember about Chicago? I just remembered it again. Is Dad was in graduate school, right? I mean, he's getting his master's degree, and he'd come home at night and he would read us Lord of the Rings, or out loud after dinner instead of watching TV. He would read us chapters out of the book.
Yeah.
I remember going on a family trip, and I think it was The Hobbit that time, and it just because that helped to pass the time. And man, I remember getting lost in to this day, if somebody says that if there's a movie version of it, I said, well, I mean, maybe you want to watch the movie version first, because there's nothing that the words, they can't touch the images that come into my head from the words that I hear off those books.
So Mom had an artist talk that she did this week over at Circles of Faith, and she was a featured artist there. And one of the things she talked about was how there were always limitations, so you kind of had to do things yourself. And I think that's the key to any kind of artistic endeavor. When you make something, there's always going to be boundaries or limitations. And I used to be very frustrated by that. And when I started working on my first solo project, my producer friend of mine, Lance Benson, said, well, there's always going to be limitations on every artistic endeavor. And he said, money and time are two of the most common, but there'll always be limitations about who's available to play, or when the studio is available, what you're able to afford in terms of production, all of that kind of stuff. And that really rang true with me when you mentioned that this week, because I've experienced that in my art, in making things, that those limitations are constant, and you can have all the money in the world and you'll still find other limitations. My engineer friend Troy worked on a project with Jane's Addiction, and it was after they'd made a huge success, and so they had 11 or 12 million dollars to spend on this project, and they spent like over a year on it. And he said they still ran up against the problem of time when they were nearing the end of it. And I thought, well, with those kind of huge budgets, you still have limitations, but it's true. And I think that if you have a boundary or a limitation, it forces the creativity in your brain to solve the problem.
Yeah.
And I noticed in this last project I did that there were all kinds of curveballs that got thrown, and I wasn't as upset by them, because I realized that's what life does best, is throw you curveballs, and they're always going to be there. And so your job is to swerve and dip and try and stay on the balance beam, and solve the problems creatively, so that everything works out the best it can. And if you do that enough, then you get to those parts where it feels inspired, or it feels easy, or it feels like meant to be. But you'll always run through those, dark forests and a little bit lost, and on your way to the end of what you're making. That's what my recent experience has been anyway.
I was just going to say that the limitations open up new avenues, because you would never find that way if you didn't have that limitation. I do a lot of ripping when I sew, and sometimes that's frustrating, but I've learned a lot from that. And so, as you said, as those limitations pop up, they're less frustrating, just because you have to find a way around.
One of the books that Doyle mentioned earlier, I think this is from the same one, that Jeff Tweedy. He talked about how we create in even the smallest. It feels like maybe the smallest of things. And for me, it was he mentioned, when you have a conversation with somebody, there's no necessarily, unless maybe there's things that you need to make sure to communicate in that conversation. But if you're there just to chat, then it can go a lot of different ways, and it's fun. I mean, and we've been able to do that since we were able to carry words, and it's fun and inspiring to me to know that it's just something that simple actually you're creating in that moment, which is pretty cool.
I actually use that concept of boundaries or limits when I do jewelry, because I like to collect just anything shiny. So I have a lot of things. And so sometimes I just have to pick a bead or a color and just limit myself to that, or nothing ever gets done. I just end up, I'm not a creator. I'm just a looker. I'm going to look at everything forever until I can make up my mind. So sometimes I just have to use that and say, no, I'm not going to do anything else till I use this bead, or.
There's a writer, Will Hobbs, and I watched an interview from him, and he had a little wind-up toy that he put on his desk. And his deal was, if he was feeling like he couldn't write anything, he would wind up the little toy, and it would walk across his desk. And by the time that the spring ended and it stopped walking, he had to be writing. And I always thought about that, because I waited for decades for inspiration, and it never showed up. And so now I write regularly, and that whole idea of not waiting for inspiration, but exercising the muscle of creating whenever, even if you don't feel like it, that's where inspiration, that somebody wise says inspiration finds you working. But now some of my most rich conversations are talking about creativity and how other people solve the problems, or creatively get their projects moving forward. I just find that fascinating, and there's a certain affinity I find with artists, because I'm curious about that, and I find a lot of similarities and learn a lot from people when I talk to them about creativity. And that's what I love to talk to people about these days.
The thing there's an expectation there too, when you do actually feel like it, and something you produce, or it comes out, and it comes out pretty like easily, and it's like, well, that's what I need to shoot for. But it's like, no, I don't think so. It shouldn't, it doesn't come that easily all the time. It's like a little bit of a trick, it's like, you got to make sure. That's great if it does, but I think the struggle is that I'm going through that particular portion of it right now. But yeah, it's interesting how, you got to keep your eye on the ball, so to speak.
Mandy, do you ever go through stretches where you don't create?
Oh yeah. I've been in one here for the last year or so. I'll start something and then I just set it aside, and but then I was laughing about what Mom said, not laughing, but I thought it was awesome that you talked about food and cooking, and And that is something I always come back to. I don't think of that as creative all the time like I should, but that's something that I do, as well. So that's always there. But the rest of it, it's comes and goes, I think. Yeah.
How have you found your way out of that when you find that you're in a time of not creating?
I think it's just finding inspiration in other people. If I talk to somebody that's doing something that I get excited about, oh, that's really cool that they're doing that. And that, it helps me to start thinking more creatively, just talking to other people who are working on things. Yeah.
I do that too whenever I hear somebody sing a song that they've written or read a poem that they've written. Then I sit there in the audience and I think, well, I could do that. You get all jazzed up and excited, and I think that's, for me, part of the process is like you have to feed yourself. You have to feed your creativity as well as express it.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, that's kind of what I'm finding.
Or go out and listen to live music, or go to the art fairs or whatever it is. That's really helpful.
For me, it's mainly if I can buy fabric, then I can be inspired. So when I go south, we will stop in Gallup, New Mexico, because that little sewing machine repair shop has fabric and it's usually pretty cool. So I will go there and I will be inspired by the time I get to where I'm supposed to be.
I'm going to suggest, Mary, that you never ever get into music because you'll be a gearhead.
Yes.
And you'll need every piece of equipment.
Yes.
Yeah. And
Yes.
you'll never make it a single dollar because, yeah.
Well, I don't know that I make a single dollar anymore, but because I buy the fabric and I'm becoming really fussy in what what kind of fabric I buy. There's places I certainly wouldn't. I don't want to waste my time, But yes, you gotta have the good things, right?
Whenever I get a chance to spend some time up to Kilby Lake, I'm doing my thing, and then I'll very so often just go walk into the mom's sewing room and start to talk to her, and she's just, it's not Gollum, but she's rubbing the precious
Yes.
all the fabric. She's
Yes.
just working her way through it, putting it next to each other. Just she's very tactile. It's fun to watch.
Very, yes.
Yeah.
And I'm free. I can do a lot of times I can do anything I want, and that's really cool. So I can create day or night.
What do you like doing more, Mom? Do you like coming up with your own thing that you want to do, or filling an order of what somebody wants? Because I know you do that quite a bit with your skirts and your shirts and all of the stuff that you do for folks that want that.
Yeah.
I think that the challenge for me is to find a process. When I get a process, right now I'm making Pendleton mittens. Okay, I've done those for years. I've made hundreds of pairs. But I have a process, so I can do that fairly easily. When I have an order for mittens, it's not a big deal because I know the process. When I have an order for regalia, which I have an order now, and it's going to be velveteen that I'm sewing on, and that's a concern for me because I've sewed on it before and it doesn't always go smoothly. So I don't want to start that until I know that I can figure out the process. So when I do the process, then it's better. I mean, I know what I have to do. And I'm excited about the colors and I'm excited about how you put those things together. But the process right now on that project is holding me back because I haven't taken enough time to research it. Do I put an interfacing in it? Is the lining going to be enough? I don't know. So
that's something that Doyle was mentioning, and Mandy, about the limitations, and they kind of create themselves when it's an order.
Yeah.
they'll give you colors already
Yeah.
or what have you. But
Yeah.
maybe that helps you to be productive.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'll learn, you know, because I have to, but I've been putting it off for those reasons. And I think actually when I get to it, it isn't going to take that long. But, you know, I want to make sure that I don't screw it up because, and when I took the order, I mean, we talked about it and all of that, and I was excited about it. And now I'm stalling because I don't want to mess it up. So I need a better process. So I'll hopefully soon I will figure that out.
I've been stalling all week. I've got a song that I'd want to get written, and I started working on it this morning again. But I don't I I don't know if it's just tiredness coming off of all the things I've been going and doing,
Yeah.
but I've
Yeah.
been kind of putting it off. And
Yeah.
once you start, like you say, it's not as hard as what your
No.
mind makes it up to be.
No.
But and I got a pretty good start on it this morning. I'm probably three-quarters the way there. But it's funny, you know, the mind games that you play with things.
Yes.
And that whole idea of not failing, oh my gosh, that's all I do is fail. I fail all the time
Right.
with what I'm doing. And now I recognize that that's okay. And when I write something I'm not really excited about, I finish and I think, okay, the main thing is finishing. For
Yeah.
me, I have to finish things.
Yeah.
And then if it's not up to snuff, I can either go back and fix it, or I can say, okay, that's my stepping stone to better.
Yeah.
Because what I found in my practice is if I write regularly, if I get two or three in a row that won't serve and I'll never go back to again, then the next one after that little stint is a keeper.
Yeah.
And so I think, okay, well, this one didn't work out like I planned, and it's not salvageable, but it's leading me to something that'll
Yeah.
work.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, don't get rid of that stuff though.
But,
Because I
Right.
do that with my jewelry a lot. Is, you know, there's stuff that didn't sell or that I didn't really like, and then I go back, you know, later and take it apart and put it back together in a different way. So keep it.
That's really awesome that you mentioned that, because I learned that from Lance Benson, you know, that you can Frankenstein different pieces together for a song. And so you keep all of your little chunks and ideas, and who knows where it's going to fit, and you can always steal from yourself. Meaning, if I
Right.
wrote this song 2 years ago, I can go back because I'm not using the song, and I can take two or three lines off of it, or the chorus or the melody or whatever. Yeah, that's interesting that happens in jewelry too. I wouldn't have
Yeah.
bet that.
Doyle, you actually had someone go through your, well, I wouldn't call it a junk pile, but I mean the stuff that's finished, and they said, what is this one doing here? We need to record this one. Like Love is a Lemon, right? Didn't Ted, because you weren't intending on recording that, right?
No, that one came too quickly. I was done within 15 minutes. And I thought, oh, this isn't right. It came too easily. And my friend heard it and asked if he could record it. And I said, sure. And it's been recorded, I think, twice or maybe three times now. And it's one that I would have left on the compost heap, you know.
Right.
But it's an interesting deal for me. What I've learned is the process is more important than the product.
Yep.
And so I just keep going, right?
Yep.
My
Yep.
idea is the steam shovel. I'm always going to be just keep digging.
Yeah.
And I may find something that works, and I may find something that doesn't, but it all leads to better. Um, and there's no feeling in the entire world. I would take finishing a good song more than winning the lottery, because I wouldn't be nearly as happy as when you finish something that comes out right.
One of the best feelings I get when someone purchases or orders from me is when they are pleased. I've been gifted sage, I've been gifted sweetgrass, I've been, given hugs from people I would have never thought would ever do that, because they were pleased with what, I produced or they asked me to produce. And that's a really good feeling too.
And it
Yeah,
creates a demand. We went to pick up wild rice at the tribal offices, and it was fun to watch Mom interact with everybody there. But she's like that. The people come in and say, "Oh, you got some more Mary Turner stuff," and it's like, "Well, where's the cowboy candy?" And so it's created a huge demand, which I think is awesome because they're waiting for it. They come. I was tooling by the place the store, I guess you call it, and just waiting to see when Mary's stuff gets on there.
It's a lot of demand. It's a lot of pressure.
But you're a master marketer, Mom.
Wow.
I've often said I should stop making physical copies of my music and just start making banana bread, because
Yeah.
if I had your recipe and we could put Mary Turner on it, we'd sell as much as you and I could make together.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well,
But
you have,
also what you do is you serve your people, and you change and evolve. And so, you're changing recipes, you're changing what type of
yeah,
products you're making, all to serve. And I know you struggle sometimes to think of yourself as an artist, but Dan Wilson, who's one of the greatest songwriters of our time, written with everybody, he says that he never gets writer's block. He says because people who make quilts, they don't get quilter blocks. He says they don't get quilter's block. They
yeah,
know exactly what they're doing. They're trying to find a way to serve their people.
yeah,
So if you're making a quilt, what's the job? The job is to make it so it keeps people warm.
yeah,
And so when I try and create something, I'm thinking, how is this going to serve somebody?
yeah,
Because then if I'm making for, even if it's just one, the smallest viable audience of one or two or three, I know what I'm doing for them, right? What I'm creating for them, how the pieces are going to go together.
yeah,
And that, I think, is a powerful way to create in my mind, because
yeah,
then it keeps me from those potholes and speed bumps of that might hang me up and stop my forward motion.
yeah,
I'm a lot about momentum. I'm
yeah,
really high on momentum.
yeah. Yeah. You have to recognize you have momentum and then go forward and keep going forward. Um, Sometimes the roadblock, but you got to find a way around it because that momentum is very important. It's a motivator, especially being at the farmers market those years. I think that's where I learned more about listening to people, because people will always tell you what's on their mind. Sometimes you think, oh my goodness, I have to change everything now because they want whatever. But what I've learned is that you listen, and, if it sounds to you like it's something that will be helpful, then you use it. And if not, you let it go. Because you don't, otherwise you also are put in a position that you can't move forward because you got all these changes or all these whatever. There's some things that I just stay with regardless, so I thank them for their input, but that's enough. I think we can use all of the positive that we can come across. Yeah. And
One of the things the arts does, at least from my side of things, is it creates connections.
Yeah.
And when I watch people come up to my mom's tables where she's selling what she makes, that's not their first time there. They'll bring their kids. There's all of this, and oh, you belong to the so and so, and there's this connectivity because you choose to make things, Mom. When I make stuff, and I sometimes am able to get some kind of a connection. It we're creating a different world through that in small ways, in my opinion.
Yeah.
A world where we have those connections, where we have that commonality, where we're not alone. Because in this day and age, like you say, boy, there's all these ways that we can just spend our time on our own, looking at our phones or watching our televisions or, cruising the internet. And so if we can build that connective tissue, I think that's so important for the world.
And I think that in our world, we're not so interested in what you do. We want to know who you are we want to know your relatives. We want to know why I should know you, all of those things. And that's really different than a lot of the world, because you tell them who you are, your education, whatever. Well, yes, that's very important, but connecting to your family, or why, I knew your grandmother, things like that. I think that's important. And I think that's, a lot of times that's a really good connector.
I want to know a little bit more, Mandy, about your statement you just made about connecting people, and if you could tell me a little bit more, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Oh, just it heals people, to be creative. And that's, I've seen that with my daughters too, that's going through rough teenagers or whatever, and they can come home and they can do those kind of things. And, we can sit around the table and make something together. It really helped them.
Yeah, art changes the artist.
Mhm.
It does, yeah.
Yeah, it does.
I would just encourage people to create and not compare, this idea of your brain, when it creates, you should leave the editor out, right? Make the thing and then go back and let the editor figure out what to do with it. But finish things, that's been the key for me, is to finish things. And I was just listening to a fellow talk last night on his web cast about how everybody has this capacity. We were born to create, and they found evidence of creativity tens of thousands of years before evidence of any kind of farming. And so that need to create is deep within us, and I would just encourage people to make something, make it, because it changes you as a person. And I felt like that's been my journey. So I'd encourage people to create.
The article that I referred to earlier says that your brain can only actively consider a problem or a solution for 90 minutes. And after that, but as you're creating, your unconscious takes over. And oftentimes you will get the solution that you couldn't come to just because you are creating. That's another benefit of that. In this day and age, we're forced to produce, or if we don't produce, we're looked at like we're lazy. Yeah. So, creating is a positive way to handle that.
The thing that was fascinating to me about some of the nuts and bolts of it, from what I can see, is I thought in order to create something, create a song, write a song, and get it recorded, that you had to just be 100% in that space and just nothing else going on. But I hear people, and I think it not only works in this medium, but also just problem solving in general. If you unplug from that, your brain is going to, maybe for that 90 minutes that Mom was talking about, it's going to be handling it. It's going to be working on it. And you don't have to actively be obsessing over it necessarily, and then come back to it. And it's like, here, let's do this. And it's less of a struggle, and it feels like it just kind of presents itself. But it's been working the whole time, which is cool to me. That's a neat concept.